Imagine coming home after months away, only to find 120 luxury houses standing tall on the land your family owned for generations. Streets paved, fountains flowing, neighbors waving, like you were the outsider. Sounds insane, right? Well, it happened to me. And the HOA behind it all? They thought they'd pulled off the perfect heist. What they didn't know was, I've spent the last 15 years exposing real estate fraud for a living. Ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA? Drop your story in the comments. Because what I'm about to share isn't just about land. It's about how I turned their arrogance into a legal trap so perfect. It collapsed everything they built, brick by brick. My name is Brian Jordan, 45 years old. I'm a forensic accountant, 15 years specializing in property fraud. My job? Following the money when things don't add up. Shell companies, fake signatures, backdated contracts. I've seen every trick in the book. I've helped put developers behind bars and expose schemes that stole homes from grieving families. So trust me when I say, I know how to spot a scam. That morning, the Arizona sun felt warmer than I remembered. I'd just wrapped up a 6-month consulting project in London and was finally ready to slow down. Aunt Margaret, God rest her stubborn soul, had left me 50 acres of untouched desert land that had been in our family for generations. She always said it wasn't just property. It was peace. It was legacy. The Uber driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror as we turned off the main road. Sir, are you sure this is the right address? I looked up and felt my stomach drop. Row after row of identical beige houses stretched out across the land that should have been empty. Wide streets with names like Sapphire Lane and Diamond Drive. Lawns perfectly trimmed, sprinklers misting the air. White mailboxes standing at attention like soldiers. And right in front of us, a sign in gold lettering. Welcome to Emerald Heights. It felt like being dropped into a Stepford dream I never asked for. I paid the driver and stepped out. My boots crunched on gravel that should have been wildflowers. This wasn't just a few squatters or a property line mistake. This was a full-blown development, 120 homes, built on land that legally, unquestionably, belonged to me. And that was the moment I knew. Something wasn't just wrong. Something was very, very illegal. I walked straight to the sales office where a perky blonde realtor jumped up to greet me. Inside, it was all marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and the faint scent of artificial lavender. A young woman in heels and a pink pantsuit perked up behind the reception desk. "Welcome to Emerald Heights," she chirped. "Are you interested in our Phase 2 properties? We're 70% sold already." I pulled out a folded document from my bag and laid it on the counter, the original deed to the land. "I'm interested," I said flatly, "in why you've built an entire neighborhood on my property." Her smile faltered, then rebooted, like a system glitch. "Oh, you must be Mr. Jordan," she said, tapping frantically at her keyboard. "Melanie Ross, our HOA president, said you might stop by. She mentioned there was some confusion about the development agreement." Confusion? There was nothing confusing about what I was looking at. Someone had broken ground, laid concrete, built 120 homes, and done it all without ever contacting the actual owner. I followed her pointing finger to the administration building, a sleek glass structure that looked more like a law firm than a community office. As I walked, I scanned the neighborhood. Cameras on every corner, private patrols, residents casting wary glances like I was the outsider. But the truth? This wasn't their community. This wasn't their land. It was mine, and I was about to make damn sure they remembered that. As I climbed the stairs, I noted the sterile perfection. Walls adorned with architectural renderings, a photo of a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and an oil portrait of Melanie Ross herself, posed, polished, and proud. Her office was cathedral-like, 2 stories of tinted glass, a sweeping view of the development that now squatted across my aunt's land. She stood to greet me, silver hair immaculate, pearl earrings catching the light like baited hooks. The woman was the embodiment of precision, every detail engineered to project power. "Brian," she said, like a snake saying your name before the strike. "So glad you could finally join us." I didn't sit, neither did she. She slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany desk. As you'll see, we followed all proper procedures. Multiple notices were sent to the registered address on file, 1223 Maple Drive. When no objections were filed, we moved forward per the HOA bylaws. Your aunt agreed to these terms when Emerald Heights was founded in 1998. I opened the folder, neatly tabbed sections, certified mail receipts, public posting photos, all pointing to an address that no longer existed. My aunt's home had been demolished 2 years ago. The HOA had sent notice after notice to a dead mailbox in a ghost house. Melanie tilted her head slightly, watching me read. "We're not required to track down heirs," she said gently. "Only to notify the address provided. That's the law. If an owner fails to update their contact information." She let the sentence trail off like a silk scarf on the wind. "Convenient," I murmured. Her eyes sharpened, but her smile remained. "I understand this must be overwhelming, but we're willing to offer compensation for your cooperation, perhaps even include your name in the next phase of the development. Emerald Heights Golf Estates. You'd make a handsome return." She spoke like someone offering mercy from a position of unshakable dominance. But I wasn't overwhelmed. I was cataloging. Every twitch in her smile, every overconfident assumption in her voice. "You knew that address was invalid?" I said quietly. Melanie leaned back, folding her hands like a judge passing sentence. "We followed protocol, Mr. Jordan. Perhaps it's not our fault you weren't paying attention." I smiled for the first time. I'm paying attention now. I stood up, maintaining my stony expression, an expression honed over hundreds of interviews and financial investigations. Not a muscle in my face moved as I said, slowly and firmly, "I'm going to need some time to review these documents, with my attorney." Melanie's smile widened a notch, no longer friendly, but triumphant. "Of course," she replied, her voice as light as a feather but her tongue as sharp as a knife. "I should just say that opposing it will be costly and futile. We have Morrison Keller and Associates behind us. I'm sure you've heard of them." I had. Who in this business hadn't? Legal bulldogs who crushed 3 environmental groups in a single season when they tried to block a cross-desert pipeline. Sued, threatened, made to disappear. And now, they were hired to deal with me. As I left the office, I heard Melanie turn to her assistant, her voice as nonchalant as if she were discussing the weather. "He's going to collapse. They always do. Always." I walked out, not looking back. But in my mind, her words were embedded like nails in hard wood. As I walked back through the neighborhood, I began to see things I had been too shocked to notice. Surveillance cameras at every corner, recording every step in slow motion. A black security car patrolling silently, its lights flashing silently as a reminder that freedom here was an illusion. A guard post at the main gate, as if I had just walked out of a prison, not an office. This was not a neighborhood. This was a fortress, built on my land. I stopped at a familiar corner where the largest oak tree had once stood, the one Aunt Margaret used to call the Pillar of Peace. Now, it was gone. In its place was a faux antique fountain, glowing with LED lights, surrounded by iron benches, bolted to the concrete. I watched the scene, speechless, and in my heart, I swore. The tree was gone. But justice was not. That night, I sat alone in my simple hotel room, the dim yellow light casting a shadow over the stacks of papers scattered across the bed. Outside the window, the distant lights of the development, of Emerald Heights, mushrooming over my own flesh and blood. I opened my laptop, my fingers tapping the keys as if by some old ritual. To others, it was just a computer. To me, it was a weapon. Melanie Ross made me uneasy, but not just because of her arrogance. What bothered me was her sheer confidence, the kind of confidence that only comes from people who have done this before and gotten away with it. I started with the name, Melanie Ross. An hour later, I found my first clue. Birth name, Melanie Ross Hutchinson, former real estate development attorney. Registration suspended in 2016, citing dishonesty, fraud, deceit, and misrepresentation of facts, in indelible moral judgment. I leaned back in my chair. The world was smaller than I thought. I dug further. Land transactions, HOA funds, development accounts, layer upon layer of financial spiderwebs, each thread leading to the same center, Melanie. Less than 3 hours later, I had a list. 15 other properties. Accidentally transferred in exactly the same way as mine. The previous owners were mostly elderly, heirs living out of state, and always the same trick: send notice to defunct address, wait for silence, declare valid. At 3 a.m., my eyes were stinging, but the adrenaline was still pumping. I wasn't angry. I was connecting the dots, and as the dots began to form, I realized what I was dealing with was more than a land grab. This was a system, a pattern, a finely tuned plan. As I saved all the data, my phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. Heard you're back in town. If you want the real story about Emerald Heights, meet me at Java Junction, tomorrow, 10 a.m. A friend. I looked at the text, then smiled a dark smile. In my experience, a friend was usually a guilty conscience, or a vengeful person. Whoever it was, they were usually the best informants. I texted back a single word: "I'll be there," and turned back to the screen. The operation began here. The next morning, I arrived at Java Junction a little early. The place was on the edge of town, far enough from Emerald Heights to be out of sight. There were no security cameras mounted on poles, no patrol cars, just a small coffee shop, smelling faintly of burnt cinnamon rolls, where construction workers drank black coffee from paper cups, and old men lectured each other on property taxes over the murmur of AM radios. I chose a secluded corner, facing the door. A cup of black coffee was set before me, steaming like a warning. 10:20 a.m., right on time. She entered as if she were looking for an escape route rather than me. A young woman in a navy suit, her hair tied back, her eyes scanning the room with the wariness of someone who had been watched. When our eyes met, she nodded and walked over to my table. "Allison West," she said softly, her voice trembling but controlled. "I think I can help you." She sat down, took the briefcase off her hands, and set it on the table as if she were disarming a bomb. Up close, I could see the makeup covering the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up her coffee. This was someone who had spent many a sleepless night, and not just from worry. "I used to work for Melanie," she began, her voice slow as if she still couldn't quite believe what she was saying. "I was fresh out of law school, and I thought I'd won the lottery when I was hired by a successful attorney. She was smart, charming, and ruthless." I didn't interrupt. Allison opened her briefcase, pulling out files one by one. Emails, financial statements, internal memos, all meticulously organized, marked as if each line were a piece of evidence in a case that had never been tried. "Emerald Heights is more than an HOA," she said, looking straight at me. "It's a loophole-legalized land grab. Melanie uses an old HOA charter to claim management rights to abandoned lots and turns them into multi-million-dollar developments." I flipped through a stack of papers. The lease. The signature looked familiar. "Forgery?" I asked. Allison nodded. "Dead signatures. Elderly people tricked into signing documents they didn't understand. Some even thought they were signing up for Thanksgiving postcards." I took a deep breath. "Why tell me? Why not tell the authorities?" She smiled, thin and bitter. "I tried. But Melanie has connections. Judges, city commissioners, even people in the FBI. When I threatened to report her, she blacklisted me. No law firm in 3 states would take me." She pushed the file toward me. "But I have copies of everything, and proof that she knew your aunt was dead, but still sent letters to her old address." Allison pulled out a colored, dated email, a string of correspondence between Melanie and her assistant. "Old woman's dead. Still sending notices to Maple Drive. It's like fishing in a dry pond." I stared at the paper. My hands tightened on the edge of the desk. The words were cold, emotionless, calling a person's death a dry pond. "So," I asked, my voice dropping, This is an operation. It's not just here, Allison said. Nevada, New Mexico, Utah. They're replicating this model. They're targeting retirement communities, abandoned land. She doesn't just want your land. She's building an empire. I nodded, silent for a few seconds. Then I opened my briefcase and began reading. This operation just changed direction. I was used to these kinds of documents, covered contracts, obscured ledgers, obscure expenses. But one document in the folder Allison brought gave me pause. An engineering report. The title, Preliminary Environmental Assessment, Parcel 12, Emerald Heights. The small print at the bottom of the page set off a storm in my head. Remediation recommended prior to residential development due to historical soil contamination. I looked up at Allison. What's this? She smiled, for the first time during the conversation. Your trump card, she said. She knew the soil needed remediation, but she built without going through the proper testing process. All the building permits were based on false or suppressed information. I flipped to the next page. The report showed that the arsenic and heavy metal levels were 3 times the legal limit. The land had been a former agricultural chemical landfill in the 1960s. This information should have put an immediate stop to any residential development. All 120 homes, I whispered. She built them on toxic soil. Allison nodded. And when she found out, she planned to use that contamination to push out the old residents and turn the area into a luxury resort. She pulled out another file, a draft of a project titled Project Clean Sweep. Melanie's long-term plan. Declare Phase 1 of the community to be environmentally unsound, force the residents out, and then sell the entire land to an energy conglomerate called Excelsior Energy. A subsidiary, Allison said, in the name of Melanie's ex-husband. They're going to buy the mineral rights for $50 million. I leaned back in my chair, feeling my heart slow not because I was calm, but because I was calculating. The law was very clear about granting permits for construction on contaminated land. If a permit was issued based on false documentation, any construction could be invalidated or even removed, and the person personally responsible for the cost of the remediation was the developer. This, I said, could bankrupt her. Allison nodded. Not just her. If you have enough evidence, we could bring down her entire system. I looked at the stack of documents like a marked minefield. A slow smile spread across my face. Good, I said. Very good. Because in investigative strategy, nothing works better than letting the enemy confidently build a castle on contaminated sand. We sat at Java Junction for nearly 2 more hours, leafing through the documents Allison had carefully cataloged. The more I read, the more it became clear to me. This was no random land grab. This was a years-long conspiracy, a machine run by people who thought the law could be bent with business cards and connections. And then, amid the pile of files, I came across something I hadn't expected to find. A cream-colored envelope, worn at the corners. On the front was a familiar slanted handwriting, Aunt Margaret's. Allison looked at me, her eyes softening. She left it to you, she said. I'm not sure I have the right to keep it. I opened the envelope with careful hands, as if touching some unspoken part of her past. Inside was a letter, handwritten. The handwriting was firm, authoritative, just like her. Brian, if you're reading this, it means Melanie Ross has done it. I've watched her for years, a predator in a blazer who speaks the language of legalese. She wants more than this land. She wants control. She wants money. She wants the silence of everyone less powerful than her. But I've never been silent, and I know you won't be either. Trust Allison. She's one of the last decent people in this corrupt system. I left something under the oak tree by the creek, where you used to camp as a kid. Dig deep. There's evidence Melanie can't deny. Love you. Margaret. I read the last paragraph over and over again, where the handwriting was shaky, but still determined. It felt like she was sitting right there, her hand on my shoulder, saying with her eyes, "You're the one who's been chosen to end this." I looked at Allison. "You know about that tree?" She nodded. I figured there was something buried there, but I never dared go there alone. That afternoon, we left town with 2 shovels and a determination that no court, no law office could break. The desert wind blew, carrying the smell of new sap from the settlement, and the memory of a land that had once been free. When the shovel blade touched the metal box under the oak, I knew I had found what Melanie had feared most: the truth, kept, planned, passed down. The sun was sinking low by the time we reached the edge of the property, what used to be Aunt Margaret's field of wild marigolds and rust-colored soil. Now, it was little more than the shadow cast behind a chain-link fence and a no trespassing sign hastily zip-tied to the gate. But the oak tree was still there, or at least its stump was. The roots had been cut, the surrounding soil paved over with gravel and decorative stone, but I recognized the spot instantly, just by the bend of the creek nearby and the faint slope of the earth where I used to pitch a tent as a boy. Allison held the flashlight. I dug. It didn't take long, maybe 5 minutes before the shovel clanged against metal. I dropped to my knees and pulled the dirt away with my hands. There it was, a waterproof lockbox, military grade. Aunt Margaret didn't believe in banks. She believed in preparation. I snapped the latches open. Inside, everything was meticulously packed. The first thing I saw was a bundle of original HOA formation documents, some dating back to 1998, with handwritten amendments in the margins, noting discrepancies between what was filed publicly and what was enforced privately. There were receipts, personal letters, even certified copies of land surveys that didn't match the official records. Underneath, a voice recorder, still functional. I pressed play. Aunt Margaret's voice crackled through the speaker. Older, slower than I remembered, but clear. If you're hearing this, then Melanie Ross finally made her move. She thinks she's clever, hiding behind bylaws and lawyer friends. But I've been watching, listening, recording. What followed were hours of conversations, HOA meetings, private calls, some recorded through an old cordless phone tap. One clip chilled me. "Don't worry," Melanie's voice sneered. "Once the old woman's out of the way, the land's ours. We'll clean it up enough to pass inspection, then flip it to Excelsior." I looked at Allison. "Excelsior?" I asked. She nodded grimly. "Energy company, deep pockets. Been trying to buy up land across 3 states. I reached for the last item in the box, a thick envelope labeled in Aunt Margaret's handwriting. "For Brian. If you want to bring her down, start here." Inside was a set of geological surveys dated 1997, showing something that made my heart stop. Natural gas deposits. "That's why she wants the land so badly," Allison whispered. "This wasn't just about housing. It was about what's beneath it. She's sitting on a gold mine." And suddenly, it all made sense. The rushed development, the environmental cover-ups, the $50 million resort plan. Melanie Ross hadn't just stolen my land. She was about to steal the future of this entire community, one forged signature at a time. But now, thanks to Aunt Margaret, I had everything I needed to stop her. The trap wasn't just legal anymore. It was personal. Friday night. The Emerald Heights Community Center glowed like a monument to artificial calm. Polished floors, pastel walls, folding chairs arranged in perfect rows. HOA meetings were usually quiet affairs. Not tonight. The room was full. Residents had come in droves, young couples with strollers, retirees in polo shirts, teenagers bored out of their minds. But under the surface, something different pulsed. Tension, the kind that gathers before storms. Melanie took the stage like a politician on campaign night. Her blazer was crisp, her hair flawless, her smile smooth and calculated. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she began. "As some of you may have heard, we've had a small dispute over the ownership of the land Emerald Heights was built on. Mr. Brian Jordan," she gestured toward me with open palms, "claims to have inherited the property from a relative, though our records show a very different legal history." Whispers rippled through the crowd. I stayed seated in the back row. She continued. "We sympathize with his confusion and grief, and out of good faith, We've prepared a generous settlement offer to put this matter to rest. The room turned toward me. That was my cue. I stood. Generous? I said, voice calm. You're offering $200,000 for land that's worth $5 million, and you call that generous? Melanie's smile didn't break. Mr. Jordan, we followed every legal protocol. I raised my hand and cut her off. Before we go any further, I said, pulling out my phone, there's something I'd like everyone to hear. I tapped play. Melanie's voice filled the room, clear and cold. Don't worry, once the old woman's out of the way, the land's ours. We'll clean it up enough to pass inspection, then flip it to Excelsior. Gasps. Then silence. Then murmurs, growing louder with each second. That's taken out of context, Melanie snapped. Really? I said, stepping forward now. How about the environmental reports you hid? The ones showing soil contamination 3 times above legal limits? I held up printed copies. You didn't just build on stolen land. You built homes on toxic ground. And you didn't tell them. I turned to the crowd. Did any of you get a full environmental assessment before you bought? Heads shook. A father stood up, holding a baby in his arms. Are our homes safe? No, I said plainly. Not without expensive remediation. And guess who was planning to condemn your homes next year? And sell the land to an energy giant? Melanie's mask cracked. This is defamation, she shouted. He's fabricating everything. Am I? I said, holding up another sheet. These are financial records showing HOA funds used to cover your personal legal expenses in 3 fraud cases. The room exploded. People stood, shouted, pointed. Someone called her a thief. Another demanded to see the books. A woman in the 3rd row pulled out her phone and began recording. Jim Harrison, her developer partner, stood and tried to leave quietly, but Connell Lewis, my childhood neighbor, stepped in front of him. Where you going, Jim? He said calmly. We all need to hear this. Melanie tried to shout over the noise, but the storm had already broken. Her kingdom, built on lies, arrogance, and stolen trust, was crumbling. And I wasn't finished. That night, as the crowd dispersed and the HOA meeting room slowly emptied of tension and disbelief, I stepped outside into the cool desert air. The silence was louder than the shouting had been. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. Jordan. This is Special Agent David Chen with the FBI. We've been monitoring the situation surrounding Emerald Heights. We need to meet. Immediately. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a small federal office on the outskirts of town, surrounded by photos, maps, and documents pinned to corkboards. At the center of everything were 2 faces, Melanie Ross and Jim Harrison. We've been building a case against Harrison for over 18 months, Agent Chen explained. Money laundering, fraud, racketeering. But we couldn't connect him to the larger network until your evidence surfaced. He paused, then pulled out a high-resolution photo and slid it across the table. Do you recognize this man? I stared down at the image. Silver hair, designer suit, flag pin on the lapel. Senator William Thornton. Agent Chen nodded. We believe he's been providing political cover for their operations. Campaign donations, land rezoning, blocking environmental audits, all in exchange for a cut of the energy deals. So this goes to Washington? He gave a dry smile. It goes through Washington. Then he dropped the real bombshell. Earlier this evening, Melanie made a call from her personal line. We were listening. She spoke directly to Thornton, told him the situation was getting out of control and that she needed favors called in, fast. I leaned back in the chair, heart beating slower now. Not from fear, but from confirmation. She was scared. And when people like Melanie panic, they make mistakes. What do you want from me? I asked. Chen's tone grew serious. We want you to play this to the end. Set up a meeting. Make her believe she can still buy you off. She'll try to use that to cover her tracks. If we can get her to admit the connection to Thornton, we'll have the domino we need. I nodded. All right, but if I do this, I want immunity for Allison. She's the reason we got this far. Done, Chen said immediately. She's already on our protection list. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed again. A text from Melanie. Let's talk. One last time. Tonight. Just us. Name the place. And I knew then. The endgame had begun. I chose the meeting spot carefully. An old agricultural warehouse off Route 47, once used for storing seed and equipment. It was isolated, cavernous, and, most importantly, unguarded by HOA security cameras. At 9:30 p.m., I arrived early. The FBI had wanted to wire the place. I told them no. Let her feel safe, I said. She only slips when she thinks she's in control. Instead, I wore a high-grade body wire, one that could transmit clearly even through corrugated steel walls. Agent Chen and his team were parked a few blocks away, listening in. At exactly 10 o'clock p.m., headlights swept across the gravel lot. A black SUV rolled to a stop. Melanie stepped out, flanked by two men built like ex-college linebackers. She carried a duffel bag, thick, square, and promisingly heavy. She didn't say hello. 8 million, she said coldly, dropping the bag at my feet. Count it if you want. I didn't flinch. I assume this comes with strings, I replied. She reached into her coat and pulled out a document, an NDA. You sign. You take the money. You disappear. If you so much as whisper about this again. You'll what? I interrupted, my tone flat. Do what you did to Thomas Brennan. That was the journalist who'd mysteriously died 3 years ago while investigating HOA corruption. His death had been ruled an accident. Melanie's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I said, pulling out my phone. Because I have an email chain where you discuss permanently solving the Brennan problem with someone named Victor. The air in the warehouse turned heavy. One of her guards reached instinctively for his waistband. That was when the warehouse doors burst open. FBI! Hands where we can see them! Melanie staggered back as agents poured in from every side. Her guards didn't resist. They'd clearly been told this might happen. But she snapped. You set me up! She screamed, struggling as they cuffed her. You bastard! You think this ends with me? I think, I said calmly, that it starts with you. She turned, face contorted, spitting venom. You don't understand. This is bigger than me. They'll come after you. But I didn't respond, because I already knew, and I wasn't alone anymore. As she was led out under floodlights, duffel bag still on the ground, I finally let myself exhale. The queen had fallen, and her empire was next. 3 weeks later. The federal courthouse was packed. Press lined the back row. HOA residents sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously. At the defense table, Melanie Ross, now in beige prison scrubs, looked smaller than ever, her sharp suits replaced by silence. Her attorney? Richard Blackstone, the infamous real estate shark of Arizona. He'd never lost a fraud case. Until now. I took the stand on the third day, swore in, sat down, and looked him straight in the eye. Blackstone adjusted his $3,000 tie and smiled with polished arrogance. Mr. Jordan, he began, isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against my client? That this is all part of a calculated scheme to extort money from a successful businesswoman? I didn't blink. No, counselor. I'm not here out of vengeance. I'm here because your client orchestrated a criminal enterprise. I'm here because she stole my land. He paced, tapping a file. You wore a wire, pretended to accept a bribe, lied. I built a legal case, I replied. The bribe came from her. I just pressed record. He kept coming, twisting facts, questioning my background, implying bias. But every attack gave me room to present more evidence. The fake mailings, the rigged inspections, the offshore transfers. Allison sat beside the prosecution, calm and steady. The truth was on our side. Then came my final move. Your Honor, I said, standing. With the court's permission, I'd like to reference Whitmore v. Henderson, 1896. Blackstone shot up. Objection, irrelevant. But Judge Carter waved him down. I'll allow it. I continued. In Whitmore, the court ruled that any structure built on private land without the owner's consent becomes the property of the rightful landowner, regardless of investment made in bad faith. Murmurs filled the room. I turned to the judge. The homes in Emerald Heights were built on stolen land, using fraud. Under Whitmore, under Arizona Statute 42-173, and under modern case law like Consolidated Developers v. Williams, I'm not just the victim. I paused. Let the words sink in. I'm the legal owner of all 120 homes. Blackstone looked stunned. Melanie gripped the table. Then, from her own mouth, just loud enough for the court reporter to catch, came the fatal blow. This is ridiculous. Tell the senator if I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. The judge's gavel came down hard. Ms. Ross, you will remain silent. But it was too late. The damage was done. The courtroom had never been quieter. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, eyes stern, voice level. He looked over the bench at Melanie Ross, who now sat hollow-eyed, hands clenched into fists, surrounded by silence and the ruins of her ambition. This court, he began, has reviewed the evidence, heard testimony, and weighed the full impact of the actions taken by the defendant over a period of no less than 5 years. He glanced at the stack of financial reports, the audio recordings, and the environmental assessments now sealed in the court record. Ms. Ross, your crimes go beyond theft. You orchestrated a complex fraud scheme, endangered families by knowingly building on toxic soil, laundered money through HOA accounts, and attempted to silence witnesses, including the late Thomas Brennan. Melanie didn't speak. She didn't blink. You did all of this not out of necessity, but out of greed. Calculated, remorseless greed. He turned to the clerk. Under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, the court finds Melanie Elaine Ross guilty of multiple counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and reckless endangerment. A pause. Then, the sentence is 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps, then murmurs. Someone clapped. The judge struck the gavel. In addition, the Homeowners Association of Emerald Heights, having functioned as an unlawful shell used to facilitate fraud, shall be formally dissolved. Control of the community shall pass to a federally appointed trustee until residents elect a new, independent body. Melanie stood, lips trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. 2 U.S. Marshals flanked her and took her by the arms. As she passed by me, her eyes met mine. There was no hatred now, just the stunned emptiness of someone who had built their world on lies, and finally watched it collapse. As the doors shut behind her, the courtroom exhaled. It was over. The HOA that had bullied, fined, spied on, and bled its own residents dry was no more. And Melanie Ross, once untouchable, was now just another inmate with a number instead of a name. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled for quotes. But I said nothing. I just stood quietly with Allison, watching the Arizona sun begin to set behind the skyline. Justice had been served. But for me, and for the people of Emerald Heights, the rebuilding had only just begun. Less than a week after the court ruling, the next legal storm hit, and this time it was bigger than Melanie Ross. The first to be arrested was Jim Harrison, the real estate developer behind the Emerald Heights project, and a key link in the interstate money laundering chain. He was caught on a flight to Belize carrying 2 suitcases of cash and a fake passport under the name James Harper. Charges: federal financial fraud, bribery, tax evasion conspiracy, and insider trading. But he was just the first. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office quickly expanded their investigation, using data Melanie had accidentally disclosed and evidence seized from a box of documents Margaret had left behind. The investigation uncovered a web of hidden interests that spanned more than a decade. Among the most prominent names, Senator William Thornton, Arizona. Over 12 years, he received more than $3 million in illegal financing from real estate developers, including projects funded by Harrison. In return, he fought environmental protection bills that would have impeded the Emerald Heights expansion. appointed cronies to state land use planning boards, hindered internal investigations by the Federal Department of the Environment through pressure from Congress. When the FBI searched his office, his spokesman responded with one sentence: "The senator is cooperating." But 2 days later, he was indicted on 12 counts, including bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to manipulate state land use planning. At the same time, 6 other county and state officials, from building inspectors to planning commissioners, were suspended and placed under criminal investigation. And just like that, the mask of due process that Melanie and her associates had worn for years now peeled away layer by layer, by law, by evidence, by truth. Emerald Heights, once a symbol of quiet power, became the starting point of one of the most extensive anti-corruption campaigns in modern Arizona history. And it all started with a bookkeeper, a handwritten letter, and 50 acres of land that no one expected would be enough to topple an entire system. Victory doesn't come with applause. It comes with responsibility. 3 days after Melanie was convicted and a slew of officials were indicted, I sat alone in the temporary office of the court-appointed trustee. On my desk was a thick stack of files: land records, home purchase orders, mortgage agreements, soil contamination reports. Outside the window, the rooftops of Emerald Heights were silent, as if the whole neighborhood were waiting to see what would happen next. I owned everything: 120 homes, more than 80 families, a tract of land that had belonged to Aunt Margaret, now mine by right. I also knew that I could sell each one, release the assets, move out, and never look back, and no one would blame me. But I remembered what my aunt had written. "They are not the enemy. They are victims of lies, just like you were. If you want to do the right thing, start here." So I wrote a proposal, not for the court, for the residents. That evening, I held a community meeting at the community center, no longer owned by the HOA, but by them. I stepped up to the podium, looked out at the faces of those who had been hesitant, who had lost faith, and I began. "I know you are angry. I know you feel betrayed. But I am not here to reclaim my land. I am here to right what is wrong." Then I presented. Each current resident will have priority in keeping their home, buying it back at full price, no interest, no penalties, no time pressure. The entire proceeds of the forfeiture from Melanie, Harrison, and their respective owners, about $14.7 million, will go to the Emerald Restoration Fund, which will fund remediation of contaminated soil to federal standards, water filtration and air testing, scholarships for area students, and finally, I propose the creation of the Emerald Heights Community Council, a transparent elected community board with control over all planning and spending. No more HOAs, no more fear. When I finished, the room fell silent. Then a round of applause, then more, and the room stood, not because of me, but because for the first time in years, they felt they had a voice, had power, had hope. I smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. Aunt Margaret had fought for this. Now, all she leaves behind is no longer a robbed past, but a future reclaimed with justice. The sun was just rising when I returned to the place where it all began. Emerald Heights still slept, the streets quiet, the lawns misted with dew, and the once silent windows now glowing softly with early morning light. But I wasn't headed toward the houses, not toward the meeting halls or trustee offices or legal stacks of documents. I was walking to the hill, to her hill. There, where the old oak used to stand, the one my aunt loved so fiercely, now stood a simple stone bench beneath a newly planted sapling, its roots still shallow but strong. I sat. The fountain was gone. The concrete had been broken and cleared away, the fake brass plaque melted down and recycled. In its place was this: a quiet space, a soft wind, and a small bronze plate set in the earth. It read, "In memory of Margaret, Evelyn Jordan Caretaker. Fighter. Believer in what is right." I reached into my coat pocket and took out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, the handwriting still firm. It was a letter I had found among her things, dated just 2 months before she passed. I'd read it 100 times, but today I left it on the bench. Beside it, I placed a single stone, smooth, white, from the creek that used to run along the back edge of the land. A token, a tradition from our family. Something to say. You were here, and we remember. I didn't speak aloud. I didn't need to. She would have hated a speech anyway. Instead, I sat in silence, listening to the wind shift through the young tree's leaves, watching the sky shift from coral to gold. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing justice. I felt like I'd arrived at it. The land was safe. The people were heard. The truth was known. And me? I wasn't the man who returned from London with a suitcase and a quiet plan. I was the man who stayed. As I rose and walked back down the hill, the sapling behind me stood just a little taller, reaching toward the light. And I knew. Emerald Heights didn't belong to developers anymore. It didn't belong to fear, or silence, or greed. It belonged to the people. And it would grow again. From this soil, from these roots, from everything she left behind. They say land is just dirt, just something you build on, pave over, forget about. But land remembers. It remembers who cared for it, who fought for it, who tried to steal it. And sometimes, just sometimes, it remembers to fight back. This story isn't just about 50 acres or an HOA gone rogue. It's about what happens when everyday people are pushed too far and decide they're not going to stay silent anymore. It's about how power can be borrowed but never truly owned unless it's earned through truth and trust. And it's about the quiet heroes, like my Aunt Margaret, who plant the seeds of justice long before anyone sees them grow. Maybe you're watching this and thinking, that could never happen in my neighborhood. Or maybe you're thinking, it's already happening, and I don't know what to do. To you, I say this. Start by asking questions. Don't assume the loudest voice is the most honest. And never forget, paper trails don't lie. People do. If you've had your own run-in with an overreaching HOA, a shady developer, or a neighbor who thinks the rules don't apply to them, leave a comment below. Tell us your story. You're not alone. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up to remind the whole neighborhood what justice really looks like. And if you're still watching this, thanks for sticking with me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Because stories like this, they don't just deserve to be heard. They deserve to change something. See you in the next one. Until then, stand your ground, speak your truth, and never let them pave over your peace. Brian.